There was once a village where the clouds moved like breath across the sky, except for one. Above the bell tower of Halberne, a single cloud remained still, as though fastened to the heavens. It did not shift, nor drift, nor break apart. And every morning, as the Bellringer climbed the steps to greet the day, he would look up at it and wonder. Stay with me, and like and subscribe for this quiet tale from long ago. Halberne was a village forgotten by most maps, tucked in a low valley where the hills folded like gentle arms around it. The kind of place where time did not hurry and footsteps echoed longer than expected. The cobblestone paths were narrow and worn, edged by moss and soft puddles, and the houses leaned ever so slightly with age, their wooden beams darkened by years of quiet rain. In Halberne, mornings came slowly. The sun, if it rose at all, was always filtered through a heavy mist that hugged the rooftops and drifted between hedgerows. Chickens scratched at the earth without urgency, and the bleating of sheep from distant pastures arrived muffled, like a memory more than a sound. It was not a place of stories, at least not loud ones. But those who lived there understood that silence had its own kind of tale. The villagers were few, and they spoke little. Not out of coldness, but because everything that needed saying had already been said in years past. The baker rose early to light his oven, the blacksmith hummed while tapping iron to shape, and the children played games passed down through generations, laughing softly into the fog. A lace of wood smoke always curled through the air, blending with the scent of damp earth and morning bread. At the center of the village stood the old bell tower. Made of gray stone and ivy-covered, it leaned ever so slightly east, as though listening to something far away. Its bell was simple, cast in iron, unpolished, unremarkable, but it rang every morning without fail, low and deep, like the sigh of the valley itself. And above that tower, always and without fail, hovered a single pale cloud. The rest of the sky could churn with wind or clear with light, but that cloud remained. It did not shift, it did not stretch, and it did not disappear. It watched the village day after day in perfect stillness. Most villagers had long stopped noticing it, but the Bellringer had not. The Bellringer of Halberne was a man named Thomlin Ward. Neither young nor very old, he seemed to exist in a place between seasons, like the village itself, weathered gently by time, but not worn through. He lived in a cottage with ivy creeping over the shutters, near the foot of the tower, where the stones were damp and mossy even in summer. His boots were always lined with dew, and his hands bore the softness of a man whose work was simple but steady. Thomlin was not known for speaking much, though everyone greeted him with a nod or a glance, and he always returned the kindness. He had been the Bellringer since his youth, following after his father, who had followed after his own. For 3 generations, the Wards had climbed the tower each morning and pulled the iron rope that summoned the day with a single, echoing toll. It was not a job that demanded much, and yet Thomlin treated it with a reverence that made people quietly respect him, even if they did not say so aloud. His days were shaped like the bell tower, tall, narrow, and still. He woke at dawn whether the sky showed light or not. He boiled oats with milk, stirred them twice, never 3 times. He wore the same woolen cloak each morning, stitched with indigo thread and repaired neatly at the elbows. And every day, as he climbed the steps inside the tower, he ran his hand along the same part of the banister, a smooth curve worn down by generations of Bellringers who had touched it before him. Thomlin loved the silence of the tower more than the ringing of the bell itself. Inside those stone walls, the world felt far away, and yet more present somehow. Birds nested in the eaves above, and the occasional spider hung a web near the narrow windows. And always, when he reached the top, he paused before ringing the bell, not to catch his breath, but to look out, because from there he could see the cloud. And though it had never moved, he looked at it each day as if expecting that, perhaps, this would be the morning it would finally drift away. There was no clock in Halberne, no bell that marked the hour. Time moved by the rhythm of habit and hush, and the day truly began only when the Bellringer rang the morning bell. It was not a loud or hurried ritual. It did not jolt the village awake, nor did it demand attention. It was a slow, deliberate act, like opening a window to let in the day. Each morning, just as the mist lay thickest, Thomlin climbed the spiral steps of the bell tower, his footsteps a gentle echo against the stone. He never rushed. He believed there was a certain grace in repetition, in the weight of doing something again and again with care. The bell rope hung from a beam of old oak, wrapped in worn cloth where it had frayed from decades of use. Thomlin took it in both hands, closed his eyes, and pulled. The bell's sound was not sharp. It was low, warm, and wide, like the sound of something breathing out after a long night. It carried through the village, rolling down the valley and into the fields beyond. Animals stirred, shutters opened slowly, and the baker placed his first loaves into the firebrick oven. The blacksmith would stretch and yawn, and the older children would lead goats along the stone path to graze. But what most did not know, what Thomlin never spoke of, was that he did not ring the bell once and leave. He remained for several minutes after, watching the cloud above him. He watched the way it refused to be moved, even when the rest of the sky changed color or form. It hung directly over the tower, like a thought the world had forgotten to finish. Some mornings, he imagined that the bell's tone would disturb it, or stir it, or even cause it to vanish. But it never did. The cloud remained, still as breath held long in the chest. And so the ritual continued, each morning the same, until sameness itself began to feel sacred. Not because the bell changed the world below, but because it rang in a world that was already quietly beautiful. As the days of spring turned toward summer, the sky above Halberne began to behave in a most peculiar way. It was not that storms came, nor that rain poured endlessly from the heavens. In fact, it was quite the opposite. The weather remained mild, the winds gentle, the rains soft and infrequent. But above the village, above the tower, more precisely, the single pale cloud remained unmoved. It was not dark or menacing. It did not bring thunder or shade the land with gloom. Instead, it hovered like a veil between the village and the sky. At sunrise, the rest of the clouds drifted eastward in long silver trails, stretching toward the hills. By midday, they vanished entirely, and the sun warmed the fields and rooftops. Yet the one cloud did not shift, did not thin, did not burn away. It hung as if it had been drawn there and forgotten by the hand that shaped the skies. Thomlin noticed the way people began to speak of it, not with concern, but with a quiet curiosity. A farmer mentioned it while tying bundles of herbs, glancing upward without stopping his work. A child pointed to it while skipping stones at the pond, asking if it had always been there. An old woman at the market said she remembered the cloud from her youth, though she could not say for certain. But Thomlin knew. He had watched it every morning for over 20 years. And in his quiet mind, he could no longer pretend it was a passing oddity. He began to feel that the cloud was not simply above the tower. It was tied to it, as if both had grown from the same unseen root. He wondered what it was guarding, or what it refused to let go of. And he wondered, too, why no one else seemed deeply disturbed by it. Perhaps they had grown used to strangeness, wrapped in silence. Or perhaps, like the tower and the bell, it was simply part of Halberne, unmoving, unexplained, and yet entirely accepted. Still, Thomlin watched. Each day, he stood beneath the cloud that never moved and asked no one in particular, "Why are you still here?" But of course, the sky gave no answer. It was on a morning like any other, clouded, still, and quiet, that Thomlin noticed something unusual before he even reached the tower. There were footprints. Not his own, and not from any villager he could name. The earth was damp from the night's mist, and the prints were fresh, pressed softly into the soil leading to the bell tower door. They were not booted like a farmer's, nor light like a child's. They were slender and sharp at the toe, the sort of prints made by someone who walked with care, but not often through muddy ground. Thomlin paused. It was not in his nature to be suspicious. But the presence of something unexpected in so predictable a place felt like hearing a new sound in a familiar song. The door was ajar. That alone was strange, for Thomlin always closed it behind him, and the wood was heavy enough that wind could not move it. He stepped inside slowly, his hand brushing the stone wall. The air smelled the same, cold stone and rope dust, but there was a quiet tension in the silence, a stillness that felt more alert than usual. Halfway up the winding stairs, he heard it. A voice not loud but steady. Someone was speaking at the top of the tower. He climbed slowly, making no effort to hide his steps, but choosing each one with care. When he reached the final turn, he found her. A woman stood at the open window beside the bell, her back to him, her cloak pale gray and edged in faded blue. Her hair, long and unbound, moved slightly in the breeze, though her figure remained still. She was looking not at the village, but directly upward, at the cloud. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then she turned. Her face was unfamiliar, though calm, with eyes that seemed not surprised to see him. She gave a slight nod, as though she had been expecting him all along. And in a voice no louder than the wind that touched the ivy, she said, "You see it too, do you not?" Thomlin could only nod. The quiet had been broken, but not shattered. Something had shifted. Something long waiting had begun to stir. The fog was heavier that morning, as though the world had decided to keep its secrets just a little longer. It coiled between the trees beyond Halberne, drifted lazily between thatched rooftops, and wrapped itself around the bell tower like a sleeping creature. The woman stood beside Thomlin at the window, neither of them speaking for some time. The cloud above them remained exactly where it always had, still, centered, and silent. Then softly she spoke again. "It has a sound, but only when it is quiet enough." Thomlin turned to her, uncertain whether she meant the bell, the wind, or the cloud itself. Her eyes remained on the pale shape in the sky. "You have heard it too," she said, as though correcting a question he had not yet asked. "Only faintly. In the mornings. Before you pull the rope." He did not answer, but he remembered. There had been moments, brief ones, when the air at the top of the tower felt thick with something more than mist. A tone without voice. A vibration without echo. He had never given it shape. He had assumed it was memory, or imagination, or something left behind by the bell's iron song. But now, standing with her in the quiet, he was no longer so certain. "The cloud," she said, "is not a cloud. At least, not as we understand it. It is older than weather. It is a memory that did not want to be forgotten." Thomlin felt the stillness of the air press against his skin. "My name is Elset," she said at last, "and I have walked the old paths to reach this tower. I came because the cloud has not moved for longer than it ever should have. It means something has remained unsaid. Or unheard." The fog outside curled tighter, and through it faint shapes flickered. Not people, not animals, but impressions. Shadows that drifted without steps. Elset looked out at them calmly. "There are whispers in the fog," she said. "You and I may be the last to listen." Thomlin, for once, had no words. But he listened, and in the silence, the fog seemed to breathe. Later that day, when the village had settled into its usual hush and the mist had thinned just enough to make out the path, Elset and Thomlin stepped away from the tower together. They said little as they walked. The road curved gently around the fields and through the quiet square, where baskets of onions and cabbages sat unattended outside the grocer's shuttered stall. No one stopped them. In Halberne, movement had always been slow, and silence was rarely questioned. They made their way to the old chapel at the far edge of the village. No services had been held there for years. Its wooden door sagged on iron hinges, and ivy framed its stone walls like a painting no longer dusted. Thomlin had not been inside since he was a boy. Elset led him past the broken pews and unlit lanterns to a stone slab beneath the far window. The glass above was cracked, the colored panes faded into soft earth tones. At their feet, a name was carved so faintly into the stone that only the morning light made it legible: Bran Ward. Thomlin's grandfather. "He was the first," Elset whispered. Thomlin blinked. "The first what?" "The first to hear it. To notice the cloud. To ask." Elset knelt and placed a small bundle beside the name. A sprig of elderflower, a feather, and a smooth black stone. Offerings quiet and humble. She touched the ground with her palm. "There is something beneath this place," she said. Something that wanted to be remembered, but not disturbed. It whispered to him through the sky, through the shape of a cloud. Thomlin felt the stones beneath his boots as if they had grown heavier. The weight of generations and questions passed down in silence. His father had never spoken of this. But now, he wondered if the bell's toll had always been more than a greeting to the day. Elset looked up at him. The bell does not only wake the village. It stirs what lies beneath. A sound strong enough to echo through more than stone. Through memory. Through forgetting. Thomlin stood still. Beneath the stones, the past was listening. The next morning, Thomlin woke earlier than usual. The mist outside was heavier, clinging to the windows as though it wished to stay indoors. The air carried the kind of stillness that comes before something begins, not loud, not urgent, just waiting. He dressed slowly, fastening his cloak with deliberate hands, and stepped out into the hush. Elset was already there, standing beside the tower door with her hands folded. She did not speak. She did not need to. They climbed the steps together, their feet barely making a sound. Thomlin touched the banister, the same worn place as always. And yet today, it felt different, like the stone itself remembered every hand that had ever gripped it and waited for what would come next. At the top of the tower, the cloud remained exactly where it had always been. Pale. Still. Eternal. Thomlin approached the bell rope. His fingers hesitated. Then Elset stepped beside him and placed her hand gently over his. "It is time," she said softly. He nodded, and they pulled. The bell rang out, not with its usual tone, but something deeper. It sounded as if the earth itself had exhaled. The vibration spread through the tower walls, down into the foundation, into the stone beneath the chapel, into the roots of the trees, and farther still. And then something remarkable happened. The cloud began to change. Not quickly, not with drama, but slowly, gracefully, as if unfolding after a long sleep. Its edges softened. It turned the color of morning cream. It lifted slightly, then stretched, then dissolved. Not into nothingness, but into air, as though it had never been separate from the sky at all. Below them, the village carried on unaware. Chickens clucked. Doors opened. Bread was sliced. But atop the tower, Thomlin and Elset stood in silence, watching the sky open like a page turning. The answer had not come as words, nor as thunder. It had come as release. Not everything must be explained to be understood. Some truths rest quietly, waiting only for the right sound to wake them. And above Halberne, for the first time in years, the sky was entirely clear. That afternoon, for the first time in many seasons, the sun touched the bell tower directly. It warmed the stone, cast soft shadows through the narrow windows, and brightened the ivy that clung to the outer wall. The villagers noticed the difference in passing, how the air felt lighter, how the sky appeared wider, but no one spoke of it. In Halberne, change came quietly, and so it stayed. Thomlin did not climb the tower the next morning. He stood instead in his garden, watching the wind carry mist across the grass. The cloud was gone, truly gone, and with it, a weight he had never known he carried had vanished as well. Elset remained in the village for a few more days. She stayed in a guest room above the weaver's shop, spent her time walking the edges of the forest, sometimes humming songs no one else seemed to know. When she left, she said nothing of when, or if, she would return. Thomlin watched her disappear into the trees, her gray cloak fading into branches and shadow. And then he returned home and made tea. The bell still rang each morning. Thomlin continued to climb the tower, to pull the rope, to greet the day. But he no longer looked for the cloud. There was no need. What had once asked for attention had been answered. What had lingered unspoken had been gently heard. And so Halberne carried on. Seasons passed as they always had. The baker baked. The blacksmith hammered. The children chased goats between fence posts. But sometimes on misty mornings, if one listened carefully, there was a sense, barely more than a breath, that something ancient had sighed and settled. Not every village has legends. Not every story must be loud to be worth telling. Sometimes the quiet ones stay with us longest. So if ever you find yourself walking a path shrouded in mist, and you hear the sound of a distant bell, know that you are not alone. Some clouds linger to be seen. And some, like old memories, lift softly when the time is right. Like and subscribe for the next quiet journey through forgotten history.